Ladies and gentlemen, we would like to remind you that the taking of photographs and the use of recording equipment are strictly prohibited in the concert hall. In accordance with New York City law, please turn off all electronic watches, pagers, and cellular telephones. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 92nd Street Y. I'm Jennifer Hausler. I'm Assistant Director of 92Y Talks, and a special welcome to all of you who are joining us by live webcast tonight all across the country, maybe even the world. For those of you who are here in person, I hope you'll pick up our new brochure and see all the great programs that we have coming up. You can also go to 92y.org and see the whole range of programming and sign up for our e-news. Tonight, we're very excited to welcome this distinguished panel of legal experts to discuss the trial of Bernhard Goetz. The panel will be led by Thane Rosenbaum. He's the John Whalen Distinguished Lecturer in Law at Fordham Law School, and he also directs the Forum on Law, Culture, and Society. They are our partners in this event. They've co-produced it with us tonight. And I'd also like to introduce law professor Joel Seidemann. He's a longtime Manhattan assistant DA, and he's producer of the Trials and Errors series. He's done an incredible job assembling this panel, and we'll introduce them now. Please welcome Joel Seidemann.
Thank you very much. You know, with these lights, it's like there's nobody in the audience, so clap loud so I know you're out there. Welcome to Trials and Error, the fourth in the series, and this program has really been amazing. We have you, the audience, to really thank. Your enthusiastic response to our four events is really going to keep us going on to future events. And I should say that we're honored by everybody who's here. Today in the lobby, I saw Justice of the State Supreme Court of New York, Bonnie Whitner, and Bonnie did not want to miss any word that was said, so she brought along with her two Supreme Court reporters, senior Supreme Court reporters, Bonnie French and Laurie Eisenberg. So we're not going to miss a word tonight. I'd like to introduce the juror, Mark Leslie. And Mark, you'll have to let us know somehow how a martial arts expert gets on a self-defense case. But I can say you wrote a terrific book, Subway Gunman, which gave insight into the jury system. It's a must-read for law students and trial lawyers in that it shows the beauty of the deliberative process. Mark, it's interesting, we have this distinguished panel, but at the end of the day, it was only your opinion and the fellow 11 jurors that counted. Now, I could say nice things about everybody on the panel, but it's interesting that Mark says it better than anybody else. Mark referred to Greg in the book, Greg Waples, the prosecutor, as an incorruptible shining knight. He also referred to you as Clark Kent. So Greg's wife, Nancy, is in the audience, and if Greg has been disappearing over the years and reappearing, then he really is Clark Kent. Greg was known when I was in the DA's office, he was the ace of our staff, and it was really well-deserved. On Barry Slotnick, Mark referred to him as an established star, a quintessential smoothie. And I knew this myself when I was the unfortunate one to have to try a case with him after his successes in Goetz and in other cases. And what better person to complete the panel than America's correspondent than Geraldo Rivera? You know, there is a Spanish word for Geraldo, and that word is mensch. But not only is Geraldo a mensch, but Geraldo brings something that trial lawyers know are important. Not only is he a terrific correspondent, but he's a lawyer. So you have the skills as a correspondent who's been in the arena, who's been on the playing field and helped educate us and shape our views of things for 40 years. And in addition to that, he's a lawyer. And it's really no coincidence that America's correspondent happened to be born on the 4th of July. Now, you saw the slideshow, and one could see that 1984 was different times in New York. You see the pictures of the subways then and now. In 1984, there were 1,600 murders. By 87, it had gone up, and by 1990, there were 2,200 murders in New York City. This year ended December 31st with 333 murders. As some of the headlines show that you saw on the PowerPoint, the media had a big role in creating notoriety for the Goetz case. And Geraldo, I think you've had some things to say about that over the years. Mark Leslie wrote in his book that when Bernhard Goetz walked into the courtroom during jury selection with 300 jurors in the room, 30 of them applauded. So there you had it, where people had opinions of the case even before the first witness was called. But it goes beyond that, because as we look at the Goetz case, we should recall the wisdom of Solomon in Ecclesiastes, who said, "What has been will be again, what has been done will be done again, there's nothing new under the sun." Mark, you may recall in your book that you said that after the verdict, there was a lot of pushback, a lot of criticism of the jury's verdict from many quarters, that this was, quote, an open season on black youth. And what's fascinating about that claim, which was nearly 30 years ago, which is if you Google open season on black youth, you'll see thousands of hits, but the hits are all in reference to the George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin case in Florida. So what we see is the issue may have changed venue, but has not disappeared. Finally, I ask the audience, before I have Thane lead the conversation, to consider these words recently uttered. Many New Yorkers are too young to understand what the city looked like in 1990. The graffiti, the decay, the crime, the social disorder. To give you an idea of how things have changed, in 1990, I didn't go anywhere without a gun because I didn't feel secure anywhere, including the subways. Who uttered those words? Not Bernhard Goetz, but current Police Commissioner Ray Bratton, who in 1990 was the chief of transit police. Thank you very much, and I'm sure you're going to enjoy the event.
All right. Good evening. Welcome you all to 92nd Street Y and the Forum on Law, Cultures, and Society's wildly successful Trials and Error series. This one, the Bernhard Goetz case. We have an audience that's watching this live. We even have, I don't know if you know this, Jen forgot to tell you or didn't want to, I think she was leaving it for me. The Jewish channel ordered this. So this will be on the Jewish channel as well, and the live stream. It's very important. Now, let me tell you why it's important. There's something about Joel Seidman, which you may not know. Yes, he's the incredibly brilliant producer of this series, but Joel actually never did have a bar mitzvah. And he's been using the Trials and Errors series as a way to compensate for that. He gets to do his little thing up there. It's like a Torah bit. And then, you know, he's had 4 bar mitzvahs, basically. And he'll be outside collecting fountain pens later. I don't need to introduce our guests. Joel has already done it. My good friend Geraldo Rivera is here. Speaking of a Jewish person who's had a bar mitzvah, people don't know this about Geraldo. Oh, Geraldo Rivera. That's not his real name. He's Jewish, and it's important. And the only reason I make a big deal out of it, this is 92nd Street Y, you have to disclose the name of all the Jews on stage. It's in the bylaws. You can't get away without that. So
My wife always plays, who's the Jew?
So let's start with an incredible clip from ABC's 2020. This is a segment that Geraldo did on the Bernhard Goetz case. This is clip 1, gang.
He spoke again to Canty, asking him what he wanted. Canty allegedly replied, "I want $5." Now, Goetz said that at this point, although he had not been specifically threatened by any of the 4 individuals, he felt that from the totality of their body language, they were going to try and rob him. He said he thought it was amusing, it was funny, that they thought they had him trapped, when in fact, they were trapped. He had already drawn his pattern of fire. According to the New Hampshire police report, at this point, Goetz drew his .38 revolver and shot Canty. Then, as he had planned to do, he shot the second suspect. He shot the third suspect as he was trying to flee the car, and the fourth suspect as he stood pretending to be uninvolved with the other three. Goetz then went to check on the first two subjects, who were lying where the two actors are now sitting. He then went to check on the second pair. Subject number 3 was also lying on the car floor. But when Goetz checked subject number 4, he didn't see any blood, and he thought that he may have missed him. So according to the New Hampshire police, Goetz then said, "You don't look so bad, here's another." And he reportedly shot 19-year-old Darrell Cabey at point-blank range.
No one was quite sure where to go with the story. And the easiest way in the early going was, here's a hero. Here's a guy who finally, the system can't do it. Here's a guy who finally fought back and tried to take the law into his own hands and fight street crime. That was quick, easy, and everybody jumped on the bandwagon. That's the way it started.
It should be noted for the record that this was not new information. The fifth shot, the back shot, and virtually all the rest of this supposedly explosive evidence was all available to reporters sitting in open court almost 2 months earlier. But almost nobody listened because they had rushed to judgment and created a mythical hero.
Wow, good segment. Geraldo, let's start with you. Was this one of your biggest stories that you covered? And can you give us a sense, I mean, for those of people who don't remember it, what was it like in the city? What was it like for a media personality to cover this? You know, we think a lot about the OJ trial, which was about 6 years later, 6 or 7 years later. But at least in New York City, this was galvanizing because it seemed to affect everyone in a very personal way.
Let me first reference something Joel said about the George Zimmerman, Trayvon Martin case. The parallels are incredibly eerie. They are almost exact. In both cases, you had a situation where crime was on the mind of the residents. In the case of Sanford, Florida, there had been the previous burglaries in the month leading up to the fatal encounter between George Zimmerman and the 17-year-old unarmed youngster. In New York in 1984, it is impossible to remember what it was like to take the 2 train, the 7th Avenue train. Every car smeared with graffiti, no transit cops anywhere, and if you did see them, they were partnered up because of the fear they had. The anarchists ruled the city. Homicide was not only a daily occurrence, it was almost every 2 or 3 or 4 hours there was a murder in this town. It was a town under siege. Koch had become the mayor, but he hadn't really exerted effective control. There was anarchy. There was incredible, as in Sanford, Florida, many years later, racial suspicions between the black population, the minority population, let me say, and the white population. There was women would not walk alone. You wouldn't even think to let your teenager take the train. And in the context of all this, remember we had the blackout riots of 1977, the Summer of Sam had happened. In the context of this, you had Charles Bronson and you had the Death Wish movies where that whole notion of vigilantism as heroes had been developed. So it was very, very easy for the white population particularly, but more generally the law-abiding or the fearful population to relate immediately to Bernhard Goetz. The fact that there were 4 of the black youngsters involved, the fact that it was everybody's nightmare being cornered on the subway. Everyone knew when the first kid said, "I want $5," that was only the prelude to a stick-up. So as I suggest there, Bernhard Goetz, and with all due respect to Barry, Bernhard Goetz became a fake hero in the sense that everybody invested in him. Unless you were the parent of a black teenager, just like in the Trayvon Martin parallel, everybody else in this town was rooting for Bernhard Goetz.
So, Greg, how difficult was it to prosecute this case, given the fact that it was a media sensation case? There may have, in fact, been a media bias. And certainly the public was so incredibly invested, especially the New York City public, which is your job to protect. I mean, it's a very interesting, it's twisted from the way we normally think about it. We normally say The prosecutor's job is to fight crime. And here you have an urban hero who committed a crime, and the victims were criminals.
It's a great challenge, but we as prosecutors have to deal with self-defense issues on a daily basis. We can't pick our victims. We have to evaluate each case on its own merits, and those that we believe require some kind of prosecution we go forward with, irrespective, I hope, of how the public feels about it.
Even though it may have been a tough sell.
I was not involved in the Goetz case when it was initially presented to the grand jury, but I was in favor of representing it to the grand jury. I understood it was a tough sell. I thought it was in the interests of justice that the case be decided by a jury such as the one Mark sat on. And
Does that mean,
sorry.
No, I'm sorry. Does that mean that a plea was offered?
Barry and I discussed a plea because I think Barry was constitutionally obliged to at least have some conversation before the trial. Barry, I recall, perhaps after jury selection, but before the trial actually began, called me and I think more or less said, I'm doing my due diligence. Is there any possible resolution? And I didn't understand him to be interested in a plea, and certainly the people were not interested in making an offer that Barry's client was likely to accept. But we had a conversation in passing.
Because, you know, one could think that perhaps this is just not the right case because of this. This is Charles Bronson come to life in a city that has experienced an incredible amount of urban violence. And as Mark pointed out, stunningly, what kind of a jury pool do you have when 30 people erupt in applause when the defendant appears inside the courtroom? It's an impossible situation for a prosecutor.
3 years passed from the time of the shooting until the trial. I think it's fair to say my case did not get better during those 3 years. But I think the public interest in having a trial, irrespective of the ultimate outcome, was an important factor. And I just don't think there was any basis on which the district attorney in Manhattan could settle the case on terms that Barry would find palatable.
Did Goetz actually speak about the possibility that he would accept a plea, Barry? Or did he feel he needed to be vindicated? He thought the will of the people were behind him.
Based upon the fact that we have an attorney-client relationship,
Oh, you're gonna-
I can't tell you what Goetz had.
Oh, you're going to keep to that privilege.
But I will tell you one thing. It was clear that the New York Times, who had some influence over this case, wrote articles and editorials. The public must know. Goetz must stand trial, while they were rooting for his conviction. And they knew about the videotape confession, which we'll all see shortly.
We're going to see it shortly. By the way, Barry, guys, just get number 3 ready to go. Not yet, but just get it ready.
I mean, the trial was an interesting trial. On December 22nd, I was in St. Martin with my wife and children. I got home and my phone was ringing. And it was a friend of mine who said, Bernie Goetz needs help. He needs you. And I said, who's Bernie Goetz? I had been in St. Martin when he was shooting. I had no clue. He said, well, he's the guy who shot the people on the subway. I said, I don't represent people who shoot people on the subway. Tell him to go commit a big white-collar crime, and I'm his lawyer. He said, you must see him. And I said, no. What's his address? The next day, I drove down to the courthouse, and on the way, I got off the highway. I stopped by his address, and there was nothing but cameras. There were people all over the place. Geraldo, your kin, they were there. And I said, this is a case I have to look at. And the next thing I knew, I was his lawyer. And it was a good thing. It was a real good thing, because I hadn't seen the videotape confession. No one had seen it at that time. And then one morning, I got a call from a friend of mine who said, you don't look bad, here's another. And I said, 6 o'clock in the morning, why are you calling me with silliness? I had no clue. He says, well, get the Daily News. I said, tell me. He said, your client told the police in Concord that he said to
Well,
one man who was
let's-
sitting there.
Right, we're going to watch this, make it more dramatic. This
Oh,
is the
okay.
actual, we're going to actually,
I am not going to tell you, but after you
One
see
second.
his confession, tell me how you vote for an acquittal.
so this is, just so we'll set this clip up, Bernhard Goetz rents a car twice. This is the second time. And he goes to, also we've got to point out that Greg Waples drove down from Vermont, which is where he lives now, because there are no subways there. And that he just had enough of that.
I retraced Mr. Goetz's path.
Right. So that's right. Goetz goes up to New Hampshire and surrenders to the police department in New Hampshire. And then New York police detectives and an assistant district attorney from Manhattan immediately drive up to meet him with a video camera. And this is the pivotal piece of videotape that essentially was really the most critical evidence that Greg had for establishing a case of first-degree murder.
This is the truth. This is the truth. You don't understand. I'm not hiding behind anything. I don't have any attorney here. I'm not going to hide behind that technicality of saying, oh, you shouldn't say this, and oh, you shouldn't say that. If the truth isn't enough, listen, if a person has to be reduced to this kind of an animal to survive in the city, if you take a rat, okay, I was vicious. I don't deny it. I told the guys, I don't know if it's in that statement, but if you take a rat and you corner it, and you, let's say just one time, you start poking it with red hot needles, and the rat doesn't know how to react, and you do this, okay, and you wind up doing it again, or perhaps again, and if once in a while a rat turns viciously on you and just becomes a total vicious killer, which is really what I was, then don't go passing statements of morality saying, well, this was not warranted, or this was, you should have done this, or all you had to do was show the gun. I've been in situations where I've shown the gun. What happened here is I snapped. Look, if I had more bullets, I would have shot them all again and again. My problem was I ran out of bullets, and I was gonna gouge one of the guy's eyes out with my keys afterwards. You can't understand this. I know you can't understand this. That's fine. The only reason I didn't do it is because he had changed his look. I ran up to the first two to check them who were on the ground, the first two that I had shot. And they were taken care of. It's all very cold-blooded, and this is going to offend everyone. I went back to the other two to check on them. And the fellow who was standing up, I was sure I had shot him. It was funny. I wanted to give an honest answer. I want to know if I missed. But I went to him the second time, and I looked at him. And he can't verify this because he was probably out of it by then. If I had shot him or if he wasn't, I don't know. And I said, you seem to be doing all right. Here's another.
Wow. That last piece on the tape, you seem to be doing all right, here's another. That sounds like prosecutor gold. I mean, this is a case of establishing Barry's claiming this is self-defense. All of his guys are on the floor of the subway. There's a requirement of a reasonable fear of bodily harm, and there's an imminence requirement, and there's a guy purportedly already shot, and there's a pause, and then you shoot one more time, right? And that essentially the case hinges on that. So Barry asked a question on whether he thought, what did you ask the audience to think when they saw that last line?
Put yourself, sorry, Mark, on the jury and decide whether you will acquit him or convict him based upon the videotape. And it gets worse, by the way. There's more of the videotape, which I won't preempt at this point. But you don't look bad. Here's another. Bang! How do you get acquitted on that? You get acquitted on that by telling the jury he's lying. Greg, whose entire case was based upon the videotape confessions of Bernhard Goetz, all he had to do was sit back and play those videos. I had to do something with it. And so we called Dr. Udowitz, who was a world-famous psychologist. And he told me about what happens to people who are in great stress, who shoot people. What happens to their memory? And he looked at the Goetz confession and he said, oh, don't worry about it. No one's going to believe him. He's not telling the truth. He's stuck in automatic pilot. And I looked at Dr. Udowitz as if he was stuck in automatic pilot. And he taught me what that was. And through 6 hours of summation, I let the jury know what it was. They had heard Dr. Udowitz. And they accepted the fact that Bernhard Goetz had never said, as he did on tape, you don't look bad, here's another, bang. They accepted the fact that Christopher Boucher, who was a witness in that subway car, and who said he heard Bernhard Goetz say, you don't look bad, here's another, bang, that these people were full of stress. And they had no clue as to what really happened. And it was, I think, upon that basis that the jury acquitted him. Because there is no way with these videotape confessions, and there's more, I wanted to kill them.
But unless it's juror nullification, unless this is just ridiculous. Greg, you're listening to Barry say, he says this in New Hampshire, but it never actually happened. He embellishes it in front of 2 detectives and an assistant district attorney. And then when he comes back, Barry tells the jury, well, that didn't happen. It never happened. He thinks it happened. By the way, there's another piece of evidence, right, which is that one of the people in the car said that they recall no gap between the 4th and the 5th shot.
Rapid succession.
Rapid succession. And so
that was my defense.
Right, so there wouldn't have been time, if that person remembers that it's not 4 bullets, pause, 5th bullets, but 5 bullets, then when was there time to say, you look oh fine to me, here's another. So Greg, when you hear Barry say this decades later, is it hard to hear this?
You mean, are you asking me politely how many times I wanted to barf during Barry's summation?
Yes, I am asking.
Quite a few. Or are you asking me how, as a prosecutor, could you possibly lose this case?
No, on the contrary. I mean, I think that we're going to get to this in a moment with Mark, because it's not clear to me when Barry says, well, obviously they rejected this and thought that it was a fantasy. I'm saying they may have also thought that it absolutely happened and didn't care.
I can't speak for what went on in the jury room, although I've read Mark's book, and I don't have any reason to believe your second scenario was the case. But it was obvious that Barry was going to defend the case by trying to persuade the jury that Goetz's tape statements were inaccurate. I felt they were by far the most powerful evidence in the prosecution's arsenal. So my main objective was to corroborate to the extent I could that which Bernie Goetz said on the audio tape and the videotape. So I called a lot of witnesses. There was a lot of contradictions. There was corroboration to some degree in what the eyewitnesses recalled, and I tried to marshal that as best I could in summation. But Barry did a very effective job of persuading the jurors that there was at least reasonable doubt as to the accuracy of those statements. And I was disappointed by the verdict, but I've never read it as a validation by the jury of what Goetz did on December 22nd. Back in 1984, I always assumed that there were a number of jurors who were deeply troubled by what went on, but given the jury instructions and our constitutional system of proof beyond a reasonable doubt, I just hadn't met my burden.
Well, Mark, can you tell us what happened in the jury room? I mean, was this a case of the Judge Crane issued an instruction on juror nullification? He was worried that this thing would happen. He worried that no matter what was the presentation of proof, that the feelings, the general feelings outside the courtroom was going to dictate the results inside the courtroom. So is that what happened, or did we actually believe a theory that Goetz never actually said that line?
We were clinging to the medical and ballistical evidence like a lifeline, because you had dozens of witnesses that were brought in front of us. Some of them had overlapping testimony. Some had contradictory testimony. But nobody disputed that there was this round dent on the subway car next to Darrell Cavy's body. Nobody disputed the ballistic reality of the trajectory of the bullet that caused that dent. And that was a really big piece of evidence for us, as were the...
But can you help me? I'm not
Sure.
sure. I'm not sure exactly what you're saying. That
So-
the significance of the pattern of the bullet proved what?
The trajectory that bullet had to take to make a perfectly circular dent and for the bullet itself to end up in the seat next to Darrell Cavy's body meant it had to be flat, because if it was an angle to the metal, there would have been a ricochet and it wouldn't have been a perfect circle.
So does that suggest that Goetz shot further back, or does it suggest that he shot close up?
It suggested that at least that bullet was shot from where he was initially sitting on the subway, not having moved over at close range and fired a second shot.
Right.
We also tried to put ourselves in the situation that these other people were in on the subway. You're minding your own business, gunfire suddenly erupts. You know, you're in a panic, and everybody there was. So you're worrying about getting shot yourself. How long is this going to continue to go on? Can I get to safety? We all assumed that if there had been a significant break and then all of a sudden another shot, that that's something people would have remembered, because the safety of the silence had been broken again, and you don't know when it might get broken again in your direction. So we believed that the bullets had been fired in rapid succession. And
What
that
about-
was a really important part of his case.
So what about Udowitz's testimony? Because in order to believe that, you also have to believe that he never said that he only said it in the videotape. Did the jury concern itself with the statement? That they just said, look, we're going to, and look, the 92nd Street Y, how cool is this? We're going all CSI on you here. But is it all about the trajectory of the bullet, or did they also discount and reject the idea that he had ever said, all right, you look all right, here's another one?
Unlike everyone else on this stage, I didn't go to law school.
Thank
so
God.
correct me if I'm wrong. There was no crime inherent in saying those words, even if he did. It was the issue of how those bullets were fired, not what words were said when.
But let's go back
So
to...
it's a different issue.
No, it is a different issue, but Geraldo, you know, one of the things we didn't show in this, I didn't want to go so memory, you know, this is like, you are there, Geraldo Rivera. But in that segment, you and Barbara Walters get into a little thing. I don't know if you remember this. Barbara Walters is sort of representing the spirit of the New Yorker, where it's a scary city, it's very dangerous, and you step in a very different way. And when you hear someone say, I wanted to gouge their eyes out, and you look fine, here's another, the only problem is I didn't have more bullets. If I wish I had more bullets.
Well, he had a 5-shot, 38 snub nose, loaded with hollow point, illegal gun. He had applied for a gun permit, as I recall, at least 2 times. He was turned down, made him crazy. But I discount, with all due respect, the niceties of the testimony, the ballistics, with all due respect to Mark. This was, those jurors put themselves in the position of a person on the subway car. They were rooting for Bernhard Goetz to be acquitted. They were seizing every hook they could get. It was a preordained verdict, in my view. They were all Barbara Walters, because of the fear that was endemic in this city, because we were gripped in a situation where the criminals ruled. We were sick and tired of our wives and daughters being put in peril every time they went to the store. There was this sense of us against them. There was a sense of, talk about a tale of 2 cities. This was a tale of 2 cities. I have no doubt. This was. I'm telling you, it gives me the chills when I think of Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. It's exactly the same parallel. There is you can call it jury nullification. Greg, with all due respect, had no chance. He had no chance of a conviction Bernhard Goetz sought to convict himself. Maybe they would have, he was just bragging. He didn't mean it. It wasn't that way. I mean, surrounded by 4 black kids, oh my God. I was once surrounded by a kid asking me for a piece of gum, and there was no way. Bernhard Goetz rode the crest of exactly what Barbara Walters expressed that night, the crest of, we're going to get back at you criminals. You're not going to take this. You're not going to keep this city from us. You're not going to keep my wife scared. You're going to keep my kids scared. That's the man that we need. He's the Superman. He's the hero. And, the fact that he paralyzed that kid at point blank range was almost irrelevant to the vast majority of New Yorkers outside of a very small percentage of black moms.
Barry, I want to add to that.
I met a couple of reverends. One of them was Al Sharpton, and he certainly was out there rooting among his folks.
We have a clip of that we'll show you later.
And I look forward to it.
Well, he doesn't look like Al Sharpton anymore.
No.
He used to be totally round. You measured him by circumference, and you'll see that. He doesn't look like him.
Then there was Floyd Flake, who had a community, a large community who listened to him. Then there was the Daily News. The Goetz case was a trial between the Post and the Daily News. They were able to get to the confessions and see them before I ever got to see them. And they did it. So the fact of the matter is that, Geraldo, with all due respect, you've been wrong this time. Mark, you were right. The jury got it. I went through my summation last night. It was 6 hours, and I read it.
If he had 30 bullets, Barry, how many do you think he would have fired?
30.
I agree.
But it didn't happen that way.
All right, but Greg, let's say it did happen the way Geraldo saw it. He observed it. He's a lawyer. He looked at it. He was passionate. Looked at this case. It does breed a certain level of cynicism. We saw this in the O.J. trial, right? There's blood everywhere.
This is the anti-O.J.
There's blood everywhere. But the case is really, the verdict really hinges on a referendum about the historic racism of the LA Police Department. So that you have a largely African-American jury who says, yeah, there's blood everywhere, but the reality is the white cops of LA hate black people, and then we're going to take it to them this time. And Geraldo's painting a very similar picture. And by the way, so did Barbara Walters in that segment, as if to say, this is a runaway jury. This is the will of the people. And the question is, you're a prosecutor. Your job is to keep the streets of the city safe. You're in this case prosecuting an urban hero. And I wonder about what was that like? Because the public wasn't rooting you on. It may be people who are lawyers were rooting you on, or prosecutors, but the public was rooting for the defendant.
It wasn't fun. As I said earlier, I believe deeply then and now that this is a case that should be tried. Whether the prosecution won or lost was less important to my mind than the facts got out. People could make up their own minds about whether this was a reasonable act by a reasonable person. I did not have delusions about the outcome. I was disappointed by some aspects of the verdict, but I can't say I was surprised. But when all was said and done and the dust settled, I think it was a just prosecution, and I have no quarrel with the outcome.
It's interesting, Joel Seidemann, who's outside doing the bar mitzvah thing, but if he were here, I would ask him, I have a feeling, and I wonder what is the ethics of this. Could a DA receive this case and say, I just won't prosecute this case? I don't feel it. I feel like these guys got what they deserved. Slotnick will do this soon. I mean, you called them everything in the book. Thugs, punks, hooligans, hoodlums. You couldn't have insulted the victims more, right?
Well, they all had criminal records.
Right, exactly. Right, to be fair.
Time out. One of them threw a shoe at me as I was cross-examining him. So the jury saw that he was annoyed.
We thought he was scratching his foot.
Yeah, but in Joel Seidemann's CLE materials, there's one really incredible anecdote. Then when, was it Ramseur? Is that how his name is pronounced?
Ramseur.
when Ramseur is testifying, you are pissing him off so much, Barry, that the court guards are moving closer and closer to him, fearing that he'll get out of the box and come attack you. And what was the impression that it left in the minds of the jurors to think, if this is what it's like in a courtroom with this guy, what would it be like in a subway car with this guy? And that's, I mean, I don't know if that was your plan.
No, but I had right to be upset, concerned. He threw something at me. He threw a shoe at me. Now, we can all laugh about that, but that's no fun. He did that because it showed the true James Ramseur.
Barry, if memory serves me, the shoe never left his hand.
No, it did. I mean, I didn't see it because court officers were jumping in front of me so I wouldn't get hit by the shoe.
Who was the defendant in that courtroom, and who was the pro?
Well, look, they were the defendants, or so I made them.
Right. Well, that's
And there was no question.
Exactly.
But they should have been the defendants.
They got shot, so they should have been the defendants.
In this case, it's very twisted, right? The victims are almost impossible to treat as witnesses and to have their testimony. And in fact, only 2 of the 4 testified. And in Mark's book, Mark says, oh my God, Greg had no choice but to do it, but I wish he hadn't, because by putting them on the stand, subjecting them to 2 things. One, their criminal records, which were easily impeaching their credibility. And secondly, they throw shoes, right? I mean, they didn't, and
they're everyone's nightmare also. Right. They're exactly what you're afraid of when you take the number 2 train.
And Greg, did you even consider, you know what, I can't even put these guys on the stand?
The first grand jury refused to indict on all charges except the gun charges.
That's right.
At that point, the case was reassigned to me, and I believe Mr. Morgenthau wanted someone else to take a fresh look at it and decide what, if anything, can be done. And I recommended, and he agreed, that we represented the case to a second grand jury. To be able to do that, however, we had to explain to a judge that there were good reasons, new evidence that wasn't presented to the first grand jury that authorized a representation. So what happened was we made a decision at that point to grant immunity to some of the young men who were shot so that they could testify, because none of them had testified before the first grand jury. And that was the new evidence that allowed us to seek a second indictment and ultimately led to the second indictment. At that point, I felt I more or less had to call those individuals as witnesses, at least the 2 whom I had immunized. The third, Barry Allen, was not granted immunity, and I did not grant him immunity to testify at the trial, and he therefore had his Fifth Amendment privilege. And
except that he spoke to the National Enquirer.
Well, that isn't a waiver of his Fifth Amendment.
I understand,
right.
But the people...
He was paid for that, too.
Yeah, he was paid $300, and then the people heard what he really thought, which was the white guy was soft. The guys jumped the turnstile. I mean, they never even paid to get into the subway, right? I mean, this is just a disaster, right? They ride on the back of a bus to get to the subway. They didn't pay for that ride. Then they jumped the turnstile. Now they're inside. Right?
The long and the short of it was I felt I had to call them as witnesses at trial. If I didn't call them as witnesses, Barry could ask and probably would have received a missing witness instruction, which could be devastating. Plus, if I had not called any of those individuals, I can only imagine in Barry's summation how big they would have appeared, right. At least in Barry's recreation.
One moment.
Yeah.
James Ramseur, the one that threw the shoe at me.
Allegedly.
No, it was an open courtroom. I have witnesses sitting out there. He went to jail for, I don't know, somewhere in the neighborhood of about 14 years.
For robbery and sodomy.
Right.
That's correct. He took an 18-year-old woman, brought her to the rooftop of his building with a gun, raped her, and she was in her 7th month, and sodomized her. He was a real good dude. He also told, ultimately, the police that we were there to rob him. Him, meaning Bernie Goetz. He also told the police that we were going to hurt him. Why doesn't anybody think about that, Geraldo? That wasn't jury nullification. These were people who were thugs, hoodlums, crooks, bad dudes.
I'll give the alternate scenario.
Who committed a crime.
Let me propose this scenario. Bernhard Goetz that day was not an innocent commuter. He was a hunter. He was an urban hunter. He was just like that fire lady in the movies now. What do they call it? That bow and arrow lady. He was seeking to eliminate the people who were preying on the city. He was looking. If it wasn't those four, it could have been two others, or three others, or one other. Bernhard Goetz had taken in his mind that he was Superman. He was Charles Bronson. He was the Death Wish vigilante. He was going to stand up and protect this town from the people that were the cancer on this town that were making it unlivable. He rode that crest of populism to that acquittal, brilliant lawyering that he had. But I submit that just like the 5 white ladies on that Trayvon Martin, George Zimmerman jury put themselves in George Zimmerman's place that night, and they saw that 17-year-old, 6'2" hoodie-wearing black kid who looked just like the black kids who had burglarized that complex in Sanford, Florida. They put themselves, there's no way George Zimmerman would have been convicted. Likewise, there is no way Bernhard Goetz would have been convicted unless you had tried him in the Bronx with an all-black jury. And even then, you probably would have hung it up.
Well, we're actually going to get to that. By the way, if you're watching from the Jewish channel, Geraldo was referring to the Hunger Games. Just,
Thank you.
I want to make sure people watching at home know what we're talking about. Let's get back to, and I'm going to actually address this idea with the Bronx jury. I let slip the Joel Seidemann question from before. Would you have considered, do you know of a prosecutor in that instance that would have said, I pass? And are there ever consequences to that? Do prosecutors have a choice to say, I'm not feeling this, I don't think it's right, I don't want to prosecute this particular defendant? You chose not to do that, but could you have chosen, Mr. Morgenthau, sorry, I think these guys got what they deserve?
I don't think that would have happened in Manhattan, because all of these kinds of cases were presented to a grand jury, even if we thought the grand jury should not return a true bill. At that time, and my guess is it still happens, every time there was a police shooting, whether we as prosecutors believe it was justified or not, we presented the matter to the grand jury. We insisted that the police officer discharged his weapon waive immunity so he could be prosecuted if the grand jury found his actions were unjustified. So under no circumstance can I conceive of this case not having been presented to a grand jury in Manhattan.
And a prosecutor declining to do it.
That wouldn't have happened in Manhattan. There are other jurisdictions where I can easily see prosecutors making that decision. And in sex crimes, the prosecutor often has to make a very difficult credibility assessment. Oftentimes, these sex crimes are one-on-one confrontations, and sometimes prosecutors, having vetted the witness, just doesn't feel comfortable and declines at that stage. But with respect to shootings, I think this inevitably would have gone to a grand jury in Manhattan.
Mark, let's talk a little about what Geraldo raised a moment ago. What people don't know, this thing has so much of the earmarks of OJ, as Geraldo mentioned. So there's now a civil trial in the Bronx after your trial. Your trial has everyone in the Manhattan jury with Mark Leslie is white. In the Bronx, is that true?
That's not true.
Oh, that's not true?
At least 2 blacks and 1
at least,
Hispanic.
Okay. But in the Bronx, it was all African-American Hispanic, unless I'm mistaken entirely. KB, the kid who got shot with the "you look all right, here's another one," who's paralyzed, in the civil case, he receives a judgment of $43 million, which I don't think he could collect on with Goetz. But it sounds a little like the Goldman case, right? By the way, when the Goldmans brought a civil action against OJ, they too won. By the way, I don't know how many were here, one of our earlier trials and errors, a totally wacky one, was the OJ one. Did anyone come to that? I mean, I'm still recovering from it. It was so wacky. I mean, Alan Dershowitz did a caricature of Alan Dershowitz. It was absolutely out of control. You would have loved. Dan Abrams played the Geraldo Rivera role, okay. and Alan did a demonstration, and there was fighting and yelling. It was really unbelievable. It was really entertaining, I'll tell you that. One of the things that Alan said, because he wouldn't stop talking, but one of the things he said was, he said, look, both verdicts are correct. The verdict in the criminal case is correct because the prosecution was unable to raise the area with guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. And OJ's a killer, and yeah, my client's a killer, and of course he didn't say he's a killer, but he said yes, and I think it's also correct that the Goldmans received a judgment for the unlawful murder and negligence or whatever the claim is in the civil action. Obviously here, Mark, the exact same thing happened with the jury in the Bronx. They made a decision that although Bernie Goetz was found to be guilty of nothing other than the unlawful possession of a firearm, they held him responsible in civil law for $43 million. Now, for people who are not lawyers, they're thinking, how is that possible? Why shouldn't the verdicts be the same? Why shouldn't the judgment and the verdict be the same? Why does it have such ridiculously disparate outcomes? When you heard the liability, the judgment in the Bronx case, did you ever call up one of your fellow jurors and say, can you believe this?
No, I never spoke to any of the other jurors about it. I did get to speak to Ron Kuby about it.
Ron Kuby represented the KB.
I mean, he was essentially the prosecutor, if you will. But I would suggest...
He did a better job.
Well, I would suggest that Mr. Goetz's attorney in the civil trial was certainly not providing the kind of work that Mr. Slotnick provided him.
Thank you.
My biggest, I hesitate to say disappointment, but if I ever had any regret about not doing something, if I could have done it in the Goetz case, it's this. I would have stood up after I called my last witness and said, Your Honor, the people called Bernhard Goetz as our last witness. But we can't do that. Yes. But I believed in my heart of hearts that if Bernie were called as a prosecution witness, he would affirm the accuracy of everything that he said in the audio tape and the videotape, as I believe he did in the civil case where he could be compelled to testify and did in fact affirm. And I think that led in large part to the verdict.
Barry, would you let him testify as a prosecution witness?
Would I allow him? Of course not.
Okay.
All right, well, but wait a minute, time out.
I'm just asking.
I had the worst piece of evidence. Someday, in this room, we're going to see the rest of the confession.
We're gonna watch some more.
I mean, it deals with Bernie venting with his anger. I killed them. I shot them. I wish I had more bullets.
Yeah, he said that. We just saw him say
that. But part of the other ones, no, the fact of the matter is, with all due respect, the jury, I wasn't in that room, had to know beyond a reasonable doubt that the case wasn't proven. And the fact of the matter is that it wasn't proven. We put on evidence. I didn't have to. I put on evidence, and in a 6-hour summation, I spent 4.5 hours talking about reasonable doubt, the prosecutor's burden, reasonable doubt. And the jury walked into that jury room, and I'm sure they remembered in rapid succession. Why is that so important? This is why it's so important. Because if there was in rapid succession, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, it would have been that way. And everybody said it was in rapid succession, except one juror, one witness, who I believe was mistaken, read the Daily News, and became a witness as a result of what didn't happen in the subway car. If we had Dr. Udowitz here, or I had his testimony on tape, you would see a very important witness.
I have a question for Barry. If Bernhard Goetz was a black guy and those 4 thugs were white guys, do you think there would have been the same result?
Hey, by the way, white guys with criminal records?
Yes.
Thugs, hoodlums,
yeah, thugs. I mean,
punks.
Same exact.
You could have said the same.
People
actually changed the race of the participants.
People, and they were like
because
the people that were.
Was the 13th juror. In Simpson, what Dershowitz, what Professor Dershowitz, our dear friend, Arthur Ardell's in the audience with me, what he and the Dream Team saw was the gigantic gap in this country between black people and white people. He saw the racial divide, and they rode an express train through it. And with all due respect, the same thing happened in the subway vigilante in the Bernhard Goetz case, and the same thing happened in George Zimmerman and Trayvon Martin. And that was the ghost that overwhelmed everything. It came to define who New York was. Bloomberg, I think, has done a lot to mitigate that raw emotion. I think we may, the jury is out on what happens now with this new administration, but I think that Americans have to cop to that reality, that this is a nation riven by race. And this case came to express all of the pent-up anxieties, all of the anger that was dividing black people and white people in this country.
In picking a jury, Geraldo.
One second, just get ready to show clip 4. We'll come to it in a second. But
In picking a jury, the first set of selections took place in the judges' chambers every Friday. Now, why was it every Friday? I was on trial in a case called USA against Gotti. I couldn't be in the state Supreme Court trying Goetz. The Daily News and the New York Times said, if Slotnick's too busy to try this case, we need a response. Let him give it up. So the judge said, every Friday we will come and speak to jurors. And we did. Every Friday I spoke to jurors. And there were jurors who said, the same morning that the Amsterdam News said, if you're picked for the jury, tell them you know nothing. And there were jurors that came and said, oh, Bernhard Goetz, who's that? We don't know who he is. We know nothing. And I remember looking at one witness and as a juror, and they weren't going to sit on that jury. And I took Bernie's head and I put it between these two fingers, and I said, have you seen his face? Do you know what he looks like? Oh, I've never seen that face before. Hey, there were communities that were riding each other.
You got
do
9
I say,
whites on a jury in Manhattan. That ain't bad.
Did I say, and it may be that it worked.
It worked.
He was a great prosecutor. You lost the case because you couldn't prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. That's the only reason you lost the case. You lost the case because we had witnesses. We had Udowitz, a Ramsar, the kind, nice man who rapes women on his rooftops at gunpoint when they're in their 7th month. Alan, one of the other nice kids who had a record yay long. All so terrible. They were thugs. They were hoodlums. And you know what? When you play segment 4 and the rest of it, these people, if they only saw that and didn't see the psychologists, the people who would say, that never happened, would convict Bernie.
Before we play the clip, Barry, Greg, was there ever a discussion, an issue, a motion, an argument before the court to exclude this tape? Did Goetz receive Miranda warnings? He voluntarily did the interview. How did this happen? You were not.
I never moved to exclude that tape.
No, but why not? Because the only evidence that Greg had was that incredibly condemning.
Because I wanted to win the case, and I knew that his tape confession, as damaging as it was, hit by other evidence, would show the jury that no guilt was proven beyond a reasonable doubt.
I had a question for Geraldo. You had asked a few moments ago, how would this have played out if Goetz had been a black man and the 4 teenagers had been white? My question to you is, would Carl Rowan have written the op-ed piece in the New York Times that he wrote if that had been the case?
Fair point. Fair point. People chose up sides. And the prosecutor had the short end of the stick. He was representing, he had no constituency south of 125th Street.
All right, let's watch clip number 4. This is more Goetz in New Hampshire during this interview.
I've heard things said about me that I was uncivilized. Okay, I acted in an uncivilized way. And if you think this is vicious, if you knew what was in my mind, the most vicious thing that I can think of is the person who said that. I wish that they were sitting there in that seat, and it is unbearable for people to live in fear. People must have police protection. The problem isn't the police. The problem is you. It's your legal system. The legal system is a sham.
Let's talk about stop and frisk. You know, Joel Seidemann in the CLE materials points out that after 20 years of Republican mayors and a stunning decline in urban crime, we now had the luxury to now vote for a progressive, an avowed progressive, that they allowed us to feel safe enough in New York City to say things like, oh, stop and frisk is a terrible thing. By the way, during the Goetz case, right, if people had said there's this technique called stop and frisk, everyone would have said, please, anything. You know, frisk everybody. Again, you know, people, you know, believe me, I'm a law professor, so I know how smug people can be. You know, and if you don't go outside, people say a lot of things what you'd say differently if you went outside. You know, so you can have very different feelings about, well, how do you feel about terrorism? You know, and what should people do about terrorism until you say, I don't want to go into a building and have it blown up. And I'm willing to sacrifice some of my personal liberties. And there is no question that for years we sacrificed a number of our personal liberties because every year the statistics went down and we couldn't believe it. We were like, can we go to 0 murders? Right? One of the largest city in the world, we have 0 murders. Like, we can't even believe it. I still can't believe the statistic when Joel said it's only 300, that we were at 2,500. It peaked at 2,500. With during the era of Goetz, it was 1,500. I remember
and rising.
And rising. Yeah, I remember. It wasn't long ago. Was it 1990? Joel mentions it in the CLE materials when that family from Utah had come to the
In the subway.
In the subway, they'd come to see the United States Open, the tennis Open, and the same similar situation. A number of kids. They knock the mother down. They kick her in the face. They rip the wallet out of the father. The boy goes to help the mother, and they shoot and kill the son. It's only 1990. 1990, there was no Giuliani, there was no Bratton, there was no Kelly, there was no stop and frisk. And you had instead a community saying, help us, anything. And so is the Goetz case for you? I think it's a cautionary tale. You say, well, let's be careful where we go, because this is how we got to the point where we started to resent stop and frisk.
I come from a kind of a unique perspective in the sense that, as you know, as Joel was kindly pointed out, I started in the New York DA's office and then was a legal services attorney, and my office was 116th Street and 8th Avenue, and so those moms were my clients up there. So I developed a sense of, you know, are they being victimized by the police? Are they, you know, is the world unfair? And then as I got older and had my own children, and my children were hanging out, and some of them got stuck up, or some of them got busted for this or that, you know, pot this or that. You have a situation where you watched a gradual deterioration of civility in the city. 77 was really the nadir of New York.
Was that when the Bronx was burning?
It was the Bronx was burning, the Summer of Sam.
Right.
It was just sheer anarchy. And there really was a question mark in many people's minds as to whether or not, and neighborhoods like this one were shrinking. You know, now you have gentrification all the way up to 116th Street on the east side. I just saw on Lenox Avenue a penthouse on the market for $4 million. In this period, this neighborhood was shrinking. The urban malignancy had come south of 96th Street. There was a sense of embattlement. The private schools all had a hyper security. There was a sense of siege that, and so attitudes like mine, really progressive attitudes, began to evolve. And then your instinct becomes, okay, you know, I want fair play. I want equal justice for all. On the other hand, I don't want my kids to get stuck up. On the other hand, my apartment's been burglarized 4 times this year. So then you start to believe that, you know, I cannot emphasize strongly enough how beloved of white people and middle-class people Bernhard Goetz was. It wasn't just the Daily News against the New York Post. It was us against them. It was finally we have someone who has the balls to stand up and stand in front of our beleaguered community and protect us, do something the cops wouldn't. Benjamin Ward, the police commissioner, wasn't he a police commissioner then, a black guy? He was widely regarded as ineffective. Koch hadn't gotten he hadn't become the man, how am I doing guy that he ultimately became as the 80s progressed and things got more prosperous nationally and the safety net took hold. It was a different time there, it's something that is fascinating to see from the perspective of 330 murders. Now, where do we go from here? I think that there's much more civility, there's much more community pressure for people to obey the rules. New York is unique in that way. Look at Williamsburg. What was Williamsburg? You wouldn't walk in Williamsburg in those days. Look at central Brooklyn. The neighborhoods now with Bushwick and Greenpoint and all these neighborhoods that are now with $2 million condos and cafe latte bars. I mean, in those days, there'd be a dead body in the alleyway and be sitting there for a couple hours before they picked it up.
Let me just add to this. We're not actually taking questions from the audience yet, but I can't resist this one. This one from here, not from our audiences at home. Before de Blasio in the era of Bloomberg's stop and frisk, in quotes, I would never dream of carrying my pistol in New York City. But now I would, with an underlined would, consider carrying for my own protection. And then this person goes on to say, do you believe the weakening of random stops will lead to more gun violence? Geraldo thinks we're living in a very different New York City. But I'm wondering if anyone else has any response that when they hear stop and frisk, they say, please don't take us back to the 80s. Now, one of the clips I didn't show, but it's long, although it's so precious, it was on your show, Koch. And Mayor Koch is on the show, and he says, oh, I'm a victim of crime, and I would want to kill a person who did that. And this is the mayor saying, I would kill a person who, I felt very victimized and traumatized by it, and I exactly understand. And it's interesting, it's almost as if he said, well, this is where the votes are, right? The votes are to say lawlessness works, and he literally admits on your show, he says people lose faith in our institutions. Barbara Walter says, including the mayor, she goes, yeah, I get it. They lose faith in everybody who works for the city, and that's why they rely and resort to vigilante frontier justice. But does anyone like this guest, one of our audience members, feel similarly that stop and frisk meant something, and that we've taken the commitment to fighting violent crime is now softer than it once was?
All I can say is everyone is watching those statistics with eagle eyes. There were 4 homicides in 3 days right as the year began, and the new de Blasio administration had just been sworn in. And everyone is in a real conundrum because we want civil liberties, we want equal treatment, but the last thing we want is for kids to start packing. And there's no doubt, in my mind at least, that stop and frisk was an invaluable tool. I think that Ray Kelly, it was absolutely appalling to me how disrespectful the de Blasio administration has been to Commissioner Kelly, a true American hero. It is the way they disrespected Michael Bloomberg at the inauguration of the new mayor was absolutely appalling bad manners. They are looking at the 2 men most responsible, along with Rudy Giuliani, of giving us a generation of relative tranquility, made this the greatest city. There is a reason why, for all of the talk now in the President's State of the Union will be about income inequality and injustice and all the rest of it, there's no doubt that this is a place where a black teenager has a much better shot at becoming a middle class or upwardly mobile black adult than he did in 1984. And I think you can, in that regard, you can credit what they've done here, what Bloomberg and Kelly did. And Bratton was a great guy. I mean, I like terrific. I'm glad he's back. The fact that he was packing a gun and wouldn't take a subway without a gun, that's very telling. You know, nowadays, I've got teenagers that take the subway all the time. That was unthinkable in those days. You know, you wouldn't even let your kid walk across the street to school unless they were escorted by a grown-up or in groups. This is a much, much different town. Just think of a place like Chicago, a civilized, functioning, world-class city with 3 times the homicides we have here. Why? Because they didn't have stop and frisk, and we did, I think.
Anyone want to step in either way in favor of stop and frisk? Because this reunion of the Goetz case is clearly, it's so nice and timely. It's not just revives our thinking about Trayvon Martin and the O.J. trial, but it also makes us think that,
Well, Bernhard Goetz would not have been stopped, and he would not have been frisked. I mean, that's a reality. It's another reality. He just wouldn't have been. I mean, that's another fact of the matter.
How sad it is that we reduce ourselves down to racism at this point. We were here to discuss the trial of Bernhard Goetz. Bernhard Goetz was acquitted by a jury that found the prosecution had not proven the evidence, the case against them beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's what happened. And he was let to go home. And it's nothing to do with the community or anything else.
Well,
it was the fact that he tried a great case. But at the end of the day, the evidence he had bounced back, and it didn't work.
let's take a look also at, guys, you get ready for clip 5? Let's take a look at everything that we just heard between Barry and Geraldo will be interesting. Watch this. This is the last clip that we're going to see.
What you have here is nothing more than a vicious rat. That's all it is. It's not Clint Eastwood. It's not, who's this guy who's shooting around people and that one movie, Death Wish, whatever it was. It's not that, what Koch said. It's not taking the law in your own hands. You can label that. It's not being judge, jury, and executioner. What this is, listen, I'm going to tell you what it is and you won't understand. This is survival instinct.
While the Goetz case was a question of self-defense, civil rights activists said the verdict of 10 white jurors and 2 blacks was racist.
No decision in the early 60s in Mississippi, Alabama would have been as racist as this. I think that we have given license to people now to shoot and say they thought they were getting robbed. Don't even prove it, but that we think we're getting robbed.
It's a bad sign for the criminals in this town, finally, because now, when they prey upon somebody, they're going to have to think twice, and they may have an X-lax attack.
Remember those guys in the subway? And, I mean, really, Al Sharpton looks so good now.
Look how young they got.
I know. I'm listening to Geraldo, and I'm just thinking, oh my God, yeah. I mean, when I was a graduate student, as a kid growing up, nobody went anywhere. We were all in some ways prisoners of our homes, and an entire generation forgot that era. Mark, when you hear all of this, do you think to yourself? I know that Joel mentioned it before. That I think in your book you said, I'm resentful that people would say that we created open season on black kids, that we weren't able to be intelligent, thoughtful people that evaluated the evidence and listened to these 2 fine lawyers and came to a judgment, and that this was not a racist verdict, but this was a verdict that's based on the presentation of evidence.
I was accused of being a racist by some of my closest friends after this trial. I got a phone call tonight from one guy I almost got in a fist fight with over it.
Back in that time?
Yeah. I mean, immediately after the trial.
Did he know you're a martial arts expert?
He's a fellow martial arts student at the same school. Actually.
Those are the only guys who do this to you, right?
The reason I wrote the book was not to make money. It was because I wanted people who are interested in knowing why we came to the decision we did to have a chance to understand it the way I did. And again, we never felt that what we were ruling put a stamp of approval on what happened on that subway car. We determined that it hadn't been proven to us he wasn't justified, which is different than deciding he was justified. And it may seem a slender legal thread, but I think it's a pretty significant one.
Barry, sum it up for us.
We live in a country that was born out of strife. We live in a great country. We have said to prosecutors, you want to prosecute somebody? You have to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. They have the burden. And that's what this was all about. Yes, can you infuse racism? Of course you can. I saw the Zimmerman trial. I know what that was about. There was no case to begin with. He shouldn't have been prosecuted. But it was forced upon the people. The fact of the matter is, in this case, at the end of all that testimony, at the end of all the theories, it came out that this juror and this jury believed Bernhard Goetz had not done anything wrong and had not been proven to do anything wrong beyond a reasonable doubt. And that's the end.
All right, before we thank our guests and send them home, a couple brief announcements, and then we'll send our home with a round of applause. The first is, if you are receiving CLE credit for tonight's Trials and Errors, you have to go to the table outside on the right to sign out that you were here at the end, and then your certificate will be emailed to you. All right, so just please, that's how it's done in order to certify the credits. Also, our next Trials and Errors event is on March 13th, and it's the 25th anniversary of the case between Larry Flynt and Hustler Magazine's First Amendment obscenity case before the Supreme Court. And yes, we're having Larry Flynt. So we'll have another incredibly entertaining, as you know, Trials and Errors. I want to thank our guests, Barry Slotnick, Mark Lathy, Greg Waples, and Geraldo Rivera. All right, thank you all for coming.
Clips at the Larry Flynt Hustler presentation.
Yeah. Yes, there'll be some porn for the clips because we have to be appropriate for the case itself. All right, we'll see you in the next. Come back to the 92nd Street Y. Thank you.